I want to try to quickly respond to some good comments by Hector Quinn. The briefer one is pointing out that the Vedic heroes were Kshatriya, the warrior class, and not Brahmin, the priest class. Arjuna and his brothers, Rama, even Krishna. So the heroic itself is a warrior class. So when you say all the heroes of Hindu society or Hindu religion, all the heroes are warriors. Well, it's like, yeah, all heroes are warriors. Now, Christianity has come along, and Christianity has tried to make saints out of priests. But those priests will never be heroes. The heroic, the definition of the heroic, going back to the Greco-Roman, the Nordic conception of the heroic, what is a superhero? A superhero is not a priest, a superhero is a warrior. So inherent within both the colloquial and I think a deep etymological, and we could even look up what exactly is the origin of this term hero. But the priest, the point of the priest is the class which strives not to bring attention to itself. The warrior is actually concerned with honor and fame. So you look at the Norse phrase, kinsmen die, cattle die, and I too must die, but I know one thing which does not die, the deeds of the honored dead. Now that's one translation, you can find other translations, but the basic point is that the warrior class of Nordic society, they were looking to become the honored dead, to have great deeds. The priest is not looking to have great deeds. The priest is not looking to become honored in death necessarily. The goal of the priest, in fact, the perfect priest would be a priest who is not noticed at all, that no one even knows that the priest ever existed, because the priest often goes into the mountains and the priest does this self-abnegation, and the priest is an ascetic, and the priest tries to eliminate the self. And you see aspects of that in the Western and the Eastern tradition. And so the priest is not about making himself the locus or the focus of mythological tales. Oftentimes the priest will use the warrior class as a kind of object to demonstrate some kind of ethical lesson. So let's look at the origin of hero. I just pulled up from Latin heros, ancient Greek heros, demigod, from Proto-Indo-European ser. So ser became her, and ser, this prefix, means to watch over, to protect, related to Latin servo, protect, and displaced Middle English haleth, heleth, from Old English hyleth. So this hero, in terms of ser, to watch over, to protect, who is the person who watches over? Who is the watchman? Who is the protector? Hector, the protector, the watchman. This is a warrior class. So the etymological origins of the word hero, and I already sort of intuited this before I even looked it up. Perhaps I had read this etymology long ago and internalized it. But the point being, the hero etymologically and colloquially in the superhero and pop culture, the hero is always a warrior. So to say that all the great heroes of Hindu society are warriors, well, yes, because by definition to be a hero you have to be a warrior. There's no such thing as a heroic merchant. There's no such thing as a heroic priest. And so the worship of the heroic is a worship of the warrior. And you can't get away from that. Now I talked... I've been exploring some semantics and certain phrases talking about people need to stop talking about white nationalism, and they need to start talking about white warriorism, because that's really what's under attack. If you want to be a white person who's successful on Wall Street, you want to be a white person who runs an evangelical church or whatever, that's fine. The problem is when you become a warrior. Really, it's not, when we talk about white trash or rednecks, we're talking about a warrior class. So that's fundamentally the problem here. We could also call it, so I had a video, White Warrior Demonology. I could have called it White Heroic Demonology, because ultimately the apex warrior is the hero. The ideal warrior is the hero. The failed warrior is something else, and we'll kind of get into that with the second comment here, where he says, basically, my flaw is I don't look at the fourth caste, that's the Shudra. And let's find where the comment is. He says, there's a lack of the Shudra or worker. And he says the problem is that I'm defining the Shudra as the conquered warrior. And I'm not sure that I am defining the Shudra, sorry with my pronunciation, but the Shudra, is the worker class really a conquered warrior class? Well, I think we can make the argument that if we're talking about Republicans, if we're talking about, you know, truck drivers and working class rednecks and these sort of people, that yes, these are a kind of conquered warrior class. But is that the majority of white people? Certainly when we look at places like Vermont, places like Massachusetts, places where the truck drivers are not actually necessarily leaning Republican, white people without college degrees are not necessarily leaning Republican. You can have what I would say is, rather than a conquered warrior class, you actually have either a conquered priest class or a conquered merchant class. And the conquered, well, what does that look like? Well, I've talked about the gypsies as essentially a conquered merchant class, that the morality of gypsy life and the itinerant nature of gypsy life is very similar to the cosmopolitanism of billionaires, but they just lack that the fulfillment of the ideal of the merchant class. The way I view it is there are 3 slots, and you can be at the top of that slot, you can fulfill the roots of that tree, or you can be stuck down at the bottom. And so you can be a very base warrior and basically be animalistic. You can be a very base priest, and that would be something like a shaman. I think transgender people have some kind of priestly aspect to them. Now, I don't think it's been necessarily very well developed, but I think there is something priestly about transgenderism. And as far as merchants, again, when you have a very poor merchant, a merchant who isn't very good at his job, then you end up with a kind of a gypsy, someone who's like a con man, homeless people are often like this. Homeless people, I think, are often a sort of a poor merchant class. And not necessarily all of them. Some might be a priest class, some might be a warrior class. I could be wrong about that. That's an interesting analysis in itself. Who becomes homeless? Why do they become homeless? You know, schizophrenia could be associated with a priest class. So is that an aspect of homelessness that is priestly? There's obviously an ascetic element. And then you have the homeless people who are addicted to drugs. So there's kind of a hedonistic merchant element. And then you have a component that might be more of a more in the body, people who are focused in the body, that might be more of a warrior element. So let's continue on with this analysis here. He's saying there's a distinction between the noble warrior and the worker, that these are very different types. Again, I have to question the idea that the average pleb or the mass man is a warrior. I don't think the masked man is necessarily a warrior. I think that might have been true in the past, because in the past 100 years ago, if we're looking at European populations, testosterone was about twice what it is today. Now, we can't even imagine living in a society where men are literally twice as masculine. We can't imagine it. But, imagine going to your local MMA club, and then that's just like the average man on the street. So that's the kind of society that we lived in the past, 100 years ago. And it's radically changed, and I think there's been a chemical attack that is a manifestation of a deeper spiritual attack. And literally, there's a sense in which the average white person today is not a descendant of the average white person 100 years ago. In a spiritual sense, we've degraded so much, or we've changed so much, that I would even make the case that there's a possibility, and this is maybe tentative, but there's a possibility that the average masked man is no longer a warrior. Now, of course, that was the case in the past, right? Because you had a warrior-dominated European society. The warriors were the ones who reproduced. The priests did not reproduce. The merchants had their own slice of society, but they were not as... you look at Charlemagne, and Charlemagne's genetic legacy in Europe is huge, right? So the warriors definitely made their impact on the population, and as Ryan Falk points out, there was a population replacement of the average European with the upper class, which was warrior descended, and that was a continual process over time. That just, there was a complete washover. You had these two populations, and it was a kind of, if you want to talk about white genocide, there was a sort of population explosion in the upper class that just overwhelmed the underclass. And so there was this total population replacement done over and over and over again. And that resulted in the average person can trace back their lineage to some sort of warrior class, some sort of warrior elite or aristocracy. But the spiritual attack that's been done by the merchant class against the masses of society, it's manifested as a chemical attack. And now you have the average Western male has half the testosterone of his ancestors just 100 years ago. And so to me, this feminizing element has created a more mercantile, and in some cases a more priestly Shudra, or like the worker class, the masses. These people are more mercantile, these people are more priestly in a degraded sense. You look at transgenderism. I see something priestly in transgenderism. It's that you're transcending the individuality, taking on a dual nature. It's a fascination, an obsession. It's an inversion of morality. So transgender people are intensely concerned with morality and metaphysics. This body dysmorphia that they have. A lot of mental diseases, mental disorders are, you have someone who is not a typical thinker. They're not a straightforward logical thinker like the warrior or like the merchant, but they're thinking outside of the box. And that's essentially the goal of the priest. The priest is someone who, unlike the rest of human society, he's not concerned with his own reproduction. He's not concerned with any of that. And so he allows himself to explore ideas which are not necessarily conducive to his own survival. And there is an element to that with transgender people. There's an element to that with gay people, that they go outside the box. Now, within the priest class, you can make subdivisions. You can say, well, there's an angelic priest class, and then there's a demonic priest class. The angelic priest class is really looking out for the Shudra, is looking out for the workers, is looking out for the masses. The angelic priest class is asking, how can we construct society? How can we construct mythology, culture, everything? How can we influence language so that society works better and is more harmonious for everyone? That's the angelic priest class. But the demonic priest class is asking, how do we destroy everything? How do we attack? How do we, set, father against son? And how do we... It's almost like the scene from Shakespeare where Hamlet takes over and the horses start eating meat, right? There's just this total collapse of the natural order, the natural hierarchy of things. Harmony breaks down. that's kind of what I see transgender people, their innermost desire is to disrupt the harmonious flow of Western civilization and to turn it upside down and to destroy it from the inside out. Now, the way that Hector Quinn explains this is he says, no, these people aren't degraded, they're not demonic priests, and they're not merchants, but rather they are Shudras. They are, and he describes them here, he says they are people driven by baser instincts, spiritual vacuity, resentment. And, you know, I don't exactly disagree with that, although I don't know if transgenderism is a baser instinct. Certainly it's about the body, but you know, and I don't know that it's spiritual vacuity. Is a demon spiritually vacuous? I would argue no. I don't have this Christian perspective that, like, you have God, and, you know, when I say Christian, I'm talking about, and I'm going to explain what I mean by Christian. Not, of course, there are Gnostics and there are all kinds of Christians, but medieval Christians, but I mean Christian in the sense of, and here is the metaphor, that you have people who say things like, you know, goodness is the presence of God, evil is the absence of God. And so when you're in the light, when you're in the light of God, you're in the presence of God, everything's good. But when you step back from God and you have the absence of God, then everything's evil and bad and terrible. And that's one of the way they get away, they get out of the Epicurean, I think it's the paradox of Epicurus, I think is the one. Might be getting that wrong. But anyway, the whole idea of, you know, if God exists, then why does evil exist is essentially the question. And they say, well, you know, evil exists just because people, through their free will, deny the presence of God, and that's how evil creeps into our universe, which I think is ridiculous. I think it's false. Maybe there's some senses in which it's true, but I clearly feel that there is a spiritual presence of demonism in the universe, that there is a negative force. It's not just a positive force, and this is basically what Zoroastrianism posits. And this is what a lot of Indo-European spirituality or mythology posits, that you have giants and you have Aesir, you have Olympians and you have Titans. So you definitely have angels and demons, right? And the demons, they're not spiritually vacuous, they're a force. And so I look at, you know, transgender people as an example of something that's not just spirit, they're not just spiritually empty people, but they're filled with a kind of a spirit that is, it's a powerful spirit, it's a clever spirit, it's a spirit, it's a priestly spirit, sometimes it's a merchandising spirit, these people who are obsessed with money. I mean, again, when I'm reading through this, people driven by baser instincts, spiritual vacuity, resentment, I'm thinking of the merchant class, actually. And I have to ask, you know, in what sense is there a merchant class of a higher sort of nobility? Maybe there is. Maybe we could investigate that. The nobility of the current merchant class, of the billionaire class. Do they have certain virtues? Sure, I guess we could say, you know, patience is a virtue, persistence is a virtue, intelligence could be described as a virtue in some sense. So back to the comment, he says, you end up assigning too many features of our modern world to the merchant rather than the Shudra. Well, I don't know exactly how I do that, but I think it's not just the merchant, that there's also a priestly aspect to this. And I think transgenderism is extremely important in a symbolic thing. It's not just that. In the same way I talk about porn as a problem, porn is just the surface level of the problem. There's a much deeper problem going on. Back to the comment, the revenge fantasies and worship of ugliness rather than mediocrities are the products of the worker, not the bourgeoisie. I disagree with that. I fundamentally disagree with that. I think the worship of ugliness comes straight from the merchant class and from the demonic priest class. I think the worship of ugliness is intelligently constructed. Now, I think the workers will essentially accept anything. They're feminine. They'll accept anything. you could sell them anything. I mean, you can sell them ugliness, you can sell them beauty. They have no innate leadership in themselves, and so I don't view the Shudra as a class capable of exerting historical agency. They don't have any ability to invent a worship of ugliness. I don't think it's a product of the worker. It's not a product of the worker. It's something the worker has been sold by a merchant or given by a priest. What's next? Bourgeoisie morality represents a type of degeneration, but there's a higher principle, one removed from the transcendent. The WASP morality of old is quite different from what we see today. Okay, sure. But the WASP morality is still alive in the upper class. Look up Bowling Alone. Look up, and now I think is it Putnam? No, Putnam's the Harvard guy who does the diversity study. I'm thinking of the guy who does things with Bill Kristol. He's like a not Herrnstein, but he's like friendly to the bell curve, and he hangs out with Bill Kristol. Let's see if I can look him up. But this guy, he talks about how there's Bill Kristol's pal is what I'm about to Google. Bill Kristol, bell curve. Charles Murray. See, again, this is a case where I just type in Bill Kristol's bell curve. I don't even hit search, and I already, somehow Charles Murray pops into my head. But yeah, read Charles Murray, and Charles Murray will tell you how the billionaires, the upper class, still have a WASP morality. They still believe in the sanctity of marriage, essentially. These people, I mean, Jeff Bezos is an exception, but these people are not on average getting divorced. Billionaires are not having a bunch of divorces. Again, Donald Trump, Jeff Bezos, these are the big sensational exceptions, but statistically speaking, I found the comment again. But statistically speaking, the WASP morality is alive and well. But these people themselves are extremely conservative. Again, you have to read Charles Murray. Like, you wouldn't believe it if you didn't see the data for yourself. These people are still extremely conservative in their own attitudes. Like Bill Kristol is another great example. Bill Kristol is someone who Tucker Carlson has described. I think it's in his book, Ship of Fools. Tucker Carlson says, Bill Kristol was more anti-gay than the person that he hated, and the person he hated there was Pat Buchanan. And the reason he hated Pat Buchanan is because Pat Buchanan was anti-Israel, essentially. Or he wasn't pro-Israel, therefore Bill Kristol says anyone who's not for Israel is against Israel, is his attitude. So Bill Kristol was against Pat Buchanan, and Bill Kristol has basically been promoting Democrats. That's his game. He says, I'm a Republican, I'm a conservative, but effectively he's always opposing people like Pat Buchanan. He's always basically lending credence to the left and saying the left, from a conservative perspective, is, the Democrats are the lesser of two evils between Pat Buchanan and... But see, Bill Kristol is not pro-gay. Bill Kristol is not, and Jared Kushner is another great example. Jared Kushner is someone with a very liberal social agenda, but is Jared Kushner cool with the LGBTQ lifestyle? No, he's an extreme Orthodox. He's part of some specific sect that I don't even remember the name of. He's not Hasid. I don't know the name. But Jared Kushner on a personal level, in his own personal synagogue and his religious sect and his group, they're not down with the LGBTQ, but socially he promotes pluralism. And that's the double standard that these people in their own personal lives, they don't want mass immigration in their own neighborhood. They don't want social degeneration in their own social circles, but they promote it to the masses. So again, I don't think this is something that the masses produced or the masses... When I look at media, when I look at Hollywood, I don't blame the average person for consuming it. And I think that's kind of sick and twisted. To look at Hollywood and say, well, I guess this is just what the people wanted. It's supply and demand. Hollywood is forced to make filth because the people demand filth. I think that's ridiculous. Now, it has to, on some level, connect with people. Obviously, it's going to make more money the more it appeals to people's base instincts. But there's so much that's forced on people. There's so much that's conditioned into people. There has to be two aspects of it. It has to be popular in the sense of appealing to people intuitively. But obviously, to me, there is an aspect where, excuse me, you're forcing a worldview on people. You're forcing people to think a certain way. You're forcing a worldview on people, a perspective. Meanwhile, a lot of these Hollywood directors are married with kids. They don't embrace the blue-haired feminism, right? That's obviously true for Harvey Weinstein. Harvey Weinstein never embraced the blue-haired feminism. He preached blue-haired feminism, but he never practiced it in his personal life. So that is who these people are, these merchants, and to a lesser extent, in other areas, the priests. Although, the priests, again, they don't make themselves as well known. But people who are preaching this tolerance, people who are preaching this pluralism, they don't practice it in their personal lives. So I think the WASP morality is still quite alive and well, and it's doing well. It's just a little smaller, a little bit tighter, and it's not being sold. Before, the average person wanted to emulate the WASP. Now the average person wants to emulate, I don't know. I don't know who the hero of the average person is. There's some wife, I'm trying to think, it's not you have Kim Kardashian, right? Who I guess is, and there was a Countercurrents article actually about this that I might have to look up. And then he starts quoting stuff about Evola and Guénon, who accepted the four-type model from Gornahur. And it's talking about the different castes. And the Brahmin are oriented towards superhuman states to apply themselves in their personal practice to the realization of final deliverance. The path of the warriors is devotional. It is more emotional than the intellectual path of the Brahmin, which is an interesting thing to say. The warrior is interested in developing the highest potentials of the human state. And putting everyone into three little classes is not sufficient. There has to be a breakdown of each, because there's obviously radically different classes. And I'm trying to come to terms with all this and create some kind of system. Right now I've just been talking about it incessantly, and I haven't been really writing anything down. Eventually I should write things down and start cataloging and building up a system. I mean, there is a Hindu system, but in anything you sort of have to learn something yourself or be able to teach it yourself. You have to kind of understand it on an intuitive level. It's the same thing in math, right? So if you want to be good at math, you have to do the proof. You can't just use the theorem. You have to do the proof. Why? Because you might forget the theorem, and then you have to go look it up. Well, much better if you can do the proof. So to understand the inner workings of how math works, rather than just applying theorems that have been proved by other people, you gain this deeper level of understanding. So that's sort of the approach that I'm taking here, is I could just read Hinduism and just accept it. But I want to, in a sense, rediscover it, what appeals to my own intuition, what I think to be true, and then compare notes with a system that I come up with, Hinduism, and say, okay, well, where do I agree, where do I disagree? Within the priest class, there's obviously in the West, we can think of a shaman, and a shaman is a very emotional priest. And maybe that jives with what's being said about the priest class being more emotional. So the shaman is more emotional, but then you have a priest class that would be very logical. I'm thinking of the Enlightenment guys, the French revolutionaries, the people who were saying we need to revolutionize the calendar to be like a base 10 system. These people who are obsessed with standardization, these people who essentially created atheism, right? These people who are atheists, secularists, pure believers in the scientific method, right? So that is in itself a kind of a priest class there. And then within warriors, we can look at warriors who are of a very brutal mind, an animalistic attitude. And then you look at warriors who are more, have more self-control. Warriors who are more strategic. Warriors who use cunning, intelligence. People like Sun Tzu. And among the merchants, you could perhaps come up with a positive example of a merchant. A merchant being someone who's very diligent and very honest and something like that. But then, of course, we have all the negative examples of a merchant. And there's a lot of power in the merchant class. So within the classes, we need to do a lot of subdivision. We need to look at the subclasses. That's something that I need to do. But no, I don't entirely agree with this rebuttal. I mean, I'm glad someone's addressing it. I'm glad people are reading it and critiquing it. And I'm going to try to pull up the Countercurrents article. That it's hard because it feels like it was just yesterday. And I do think I brought it up somewhere in one of the comments. Let's see. We were talking about Dalit. So I'm going to look up the most recent article on Dalit. Sicilian Nightmares by Nicholas R. Gilvey. And there's some kind of weird introduction. There's a hidden fourth being the Dalit class, the lumpen proletariat, the... I think was his point that perpetual rule by merchants seems like a terrible fate. There can be no perpetual rule by Dalit for a simple reason. And he's going... Rule by Dalit will be nasty, brutish, and short. That's the Kali Yuga. The beggar steals the stick of power from the merchant. Still ruled by merchants. What is this shift going to look like? With a ruling class being Dalit. And here I think he says that the Kardashians are, I think, an example of Dalit. The Kali Yuga is still not upon us. Still the merchants run the shows, spiritually speaking. And we go through... Trump, I guess, is a merchant, and he's ruling. Although, I kind of question whether Trump is really a merchant or not. I have a theory about CEOs, that CEOs are actually, by and large, a warrior class. CEOs are tall, CEOs are handsome. CEOs don't rule because they're smart, necessarily, although they're pretty smart. But they don't. CEOs don't rule because they actually make good decisions. CEOs rule because they have charisma. And you have a company, and people say, we need a face of the company. We need some form of accountability for our company. And so they say, well, who should be the CEO? And they pick a warrior instinctually, because people are always looking toward the warrior class for leadership. That's just a natural, instinctual thing. So I actually have a theory that a lot of CEOs are not merchants. They're actually warriors, and people are picking them because of the appearance of competence rather than actual competence. He said in the article, says Barack Obama would be President Dalit, and then he makes it, well, he's saying he's responding to the claim that Barack Obama was a Dalit. And was he a Dalit? Was he a merchant? Was he a priest? I think of Obama as a priestly type. Michelle Obama, was she, I guess she was a lawyer. Ocasio-Cortez is a possible Dalit. And, I mean, you can read the article yourself. It's, and then Alec Venner, the commenter, man, I told him, I said, comment on this video. And he commented, and unfortunately, There was no response. I thought there might have been a response. So we're going back and forth, and we're arguing about the place of the Dalit. Are we being ruled by merchants? Are we being ruled by Dalit? Are we in a Kali Yuga, an age of Dalit rule by Dalit? Are we in a age of rule by merchants? What is the place of the warrior class? What's the place of the priest class? This is the thing I'm interested in right now. So I'm glad to see some people responding. Again, the article is Sicilian Nightmares by Nicholas R. Gilvi on County. What a weird name, Gilvi. So thank you to, what was it, Hector Quinn? What was his name? Yeah, Hector Quinn. So thanks, Hector, for the comment. Intellectually stimulating. This is something that I've been, it's a very amorphous topic because you can take it in so many different directions. I've been thinking about making a physiognomy video on The Legend of Zelda, specifically Ganondorf, kind of focusing on that as an example of a merchant type, maybe a merchant warrior hybrid or something. Looking at that, so there's a lot of, you can get very detailed about this stuff. I mean, we could talk about the proportions of the nose as an aspect of class, and we can get very specific in that way, and then we can also zoom out and talk about it in huge trends. And one of the reasons why I like to stick to the number 3 is because when we talk about civilizations, I think there are basically 3 main civilizations, 3 global civilizations. That is Western civilization, Eastern civilization, and Middle Eastern civilization. Those are the 3 global civilizations. Those are the civilizations that are competitive on a global scale. You had the Mongol Empire, almost conquered Eurasia. You obviously have the West, and then you have the Middle East. And these 3, and you can call them various names. You can say, well, the Indo-European, the East Asian, and the Magian, or however you want to move around the terminology. Those are the 3 main civilizations. To me, there is no Dalit civilization. It's kind of a contradiction in term. You can't have rule by Dalit. I guess we could talk about African civilization. But to me, Dalit is you failed. You failed. And there's a million infinite ways to fail. And so in a sense, there are a million infinite Dalit civilizations. But that's not what I mean when I say civilization. When I say civilization, I mean a structure, a reproducing, stable structure that exerts power outward and inward, and that has some viability to it. So you can have a priest-led society, you can have a merchant-led society, you can have a warrior-led society. You can't have a Dalit-led society, because if you have a Dalit-led society, then you get crushed by one of the other 3 global powers. That's what's happening to Africa. It's not that Africa decolonized from Europe. The Europeans went away, and now Africa is an independent ethno-nationalist continent. And I guess that's the way Dugin imagines it, right? Dugin says that we're going to have pluralism, we're going to have Eurasianism, we're going to have, a Pan-African, we're going to have the African Union, we're going to have the Eurasian Union, we're going to have all of these different cultural spheres, and within them we're going to have particularities, we're going to protect all the cultures. That's not what's going on. China is going in, colonizing Africa. That's really all you need to know to see this whole thing is a farce. The idea of rule by Dalit, the idea of, and I wanted to talk about ethno-nationalism and the concept that it's, in order to have ethno-nationalism, you need this really fine balance. So take Germany and France. Germany and France, let's say Germany and France hate each other. They absolutely hate each other. They want to exterminate the other population. Well, you can't have ethno-nationalism, because the moment that Germany or France gains the upper hand, Napoleon's going to run roughshod over Germany and conquer Germany, and there's no more German ethno-state. Or, alternative, Hitler is going to invade France and destroy the French people. Now, I'm using those historical, actors as a reference point in your mind for understanding how one country could conquer the other. Obviously, I'm not saying that Hitler wanted to genocide the French people. That's obviously not true. And I'm obviously not saying that Napoleon wanted to genocide the German people. That's obviously not true. In some way, Napoleon was a proponent of German ethno-nationalism because he created the Confederation of the Rhine, which overrode all of these individual principalities that had been separating the German people from one another on a political level. So in a way, he advanced German nationalism. Of course, German nationalists at the time didn't see it that way, but in retrospect, we can sort of see Confederation of the Rhine sort of setting up the Second Reich, the Reich of Bismarck. So, looking at these two states, if they hate each other with a bloodlust, then ethno-nationalism can't survive. If they mutually wish for the destruction of the other one, you can't have ethno-nationalism because ultimately someone's going to get a leg up on the other. You can't have this perfect, and that was the idea of the alliance system. The alliance system in Europe prior to World War I is like, we have to keep this balance of power. But unfortunately, there came a day where the Axis, the German powers, the German-Austrian power, it was stronger than the other half of the equation, the British, the French, the Russians. And it was only with the help of the Americans that Germany lost World War II. So there came a point at which Germany had its day in the sun, it had its moment where it could compete with all the other European powers. France had a moment like that as well during the Napoleonic Wars, where it almost beat all the European powers. So again, you have these historical cycles of nations. Nations rise and fall, they gain and they lose power, they ascend and they decline. And so looking at that, we understand then that ethno-nationalism is unworkable if people hate each other. If Germans and French people hate each other, you can't have ethno-states, because one day the French Empire is going to take over Germany, or the German Empire is going to take over France. And then ethno-nationalism is not going to work anymore, even with very similar genetic. I mean, French and German people, very similar, next-door neighbors, a lot of similarities between the two. Ultimately, it's not tenable to have ethno-states if they hate each other. But what if they like each other? What if they respect each other? What if they're friends? Well, then ethno-nationalism starts to become tenable. The problem is, when they're too friendly, then what do you get? The European Union. And when they say, oh, we just love each other so much, oh yeah, we speak a different language, that's fine. Hey, we can all speak English, right? So when people get too friendly, so you have this strong, when you have a xenophobic world, when Germany and France hate each other, you can't have ethno-nationalism. It's unworkable. It eventually falls apart. One conquers the other, they destroy each other. And someone's the victor. Someone's the loser, someone's the winner. But if you're completely the opposite, if you're xenophilic, ethno-nationalism can't work either, because you're like, oh, well, we're all brothers and sisters, we can all get along, doesn't matter whether you're French or German. And so at that point, the identity also disintegrates. So there is some kind of sweet spot in the middle, where you're not too xenophobic, you're not too xenophilic, and that's when ethno-nationalism works. But that's a very particular moment in time, that's a very particular cultural situation. And that's not the majority of history. The majority of history is next-door neighbors hating each other, or getting along quite well. So, there are a lot of, Yugoslavia is a good example. At certain points, Yugoslavia was seen as tenable, or Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia is another great example. The Czechs and the Slovaks, everyone was like, hey, they're so similar, let's just put them together. And so they thought, hey, Czechoslovakia, that's an ethnic group. You're a Czechoslovak. And, I mean, it's kind of silly looking retrospectively, but you had a velvet divorce, and Czech Republic became its own thing, and then Slovakia became its own thing. So there was a point, there was a historical moment when people said, you know what, Czechoslovakia, it's one country. It's an ethnically homogeneous country. The Czechs and the Slovaks, they're basically the same. It's like Yankees versus Southerners. Basically, we're all Americans, right? We can all have our own, we're the nation of America. It's not like there's a separate nation of Dixie and a separate nation of Yankeedom, but we're all part of the nation of America. At that historical moment, people said, yeah, that's the way it is. with Czechoslovakia. But now we see, oh no, Czechs and Slovaks, they're two different ethnicities. They need separate ethno-states. So this question of who belongs in the ethno-state is a very ambiguous question that's always constantly changing because culture is constantly changing. So, anytime you look at a map and you say, this is the perfect ethno-nationalist map for any given region, say Europe or Africa or Asia, wherever, to say that, well, and to say that's going to work for all time, these are the permanent boundaries, permanent borders for all time, that's unworkable because cultural attitudes are going to change. Some countries are going to become more imperialist. They're going to invade their neighbors. Other countries are going to become more xenophilic. And they're going to embrace their neighbors and say, we should all just mix together. So there are different moments, different seasons for a more aggressive, choleric, phlegmatic attitude. And then there are times for a more sanguine, let's all get together, And then the other aspect of it, and I've wanted to talk about the four humors for a while, but the other aspect of it is the melancholic cultural attitude. So obviously the phlegmatic is like, get away from us, the country's full, we don't want any more immigrants. That's sort of a phlegmatic attitude. A choleric attitude is like, we're going to invade the world, or we're going to conquer everybody, and that's kind of like the Roman Empire imperialism. And then you have the sanguine, which is like, let refugees in, we're all brothers and sisters, we all love each other. But then the melancholic attitude, a lot of times people don't consider the melancholic attitude. The melancholic attitude is where you say, life is pointless, I hate my life, I have a terrible job, my parents are divorced, I'm probably going to divorce my wife, she's going to steal my kids, so you're just melancholic, and you're like, so they want to flood the country with refugees, huh? Well, I don't control any other aspect of my life, and everything's messed up, and the whole universe is godless, and everything's terrible. So yeah, let the refugees in. That's the melancholic attitude, right? So the melancholic and the sanguine are both passive in that sense, whereas the phlegmatic and the choleric are more xenophilic. It's not that the melancholic is like xenophilic. It's not that they want the refugees necessarily in the country. They just don't care. They think, well, at least we'll have more ethnic food, and that they have a very low self-esteem, and they think, I guess immigrants are better than native workers, and so on and so forth. So, I don't know, we covered a lot of topics. Thanks for commenting. Thank you for listening. See you again next time. Bye-bye.